The following Keep the Joking Gamer video may include adult language, partial nudity, and adult situations. Parental discretion is advised.
What could it be? Beauty Boy Gaming Community! Yay!
I would normally get some kind of rowdy crowd thing going, but I just want to thank you all for getting up this early to come see us.
Yes.
So thank you very much. We are the two guys that started the clanofthegraywolf.com. I am the Commodore, and this is Rue.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about classic RPGs today. We're going to do it in a way that would not indicate what we were up to last night.
Yes, we should.
What were we up to last night? I don't really remember.
Sleeping.
Oh, okay.
We should also probably mention, because if you look in the panel, a note that the world of swear is supposed to be also on this panel. But
really?
Yes, but David and I are not here. So unfortunately, it's just us.
Hey, Norm was supposed to be here too. He's let me down.
That's
Norm's
good.
awake.
Well,
I can go find him.
No, it's okay. We can do that. I got my power back, so I'm good. Yeah, so classic RPGs. So we're gonna talk about classic RPGs from days of yore. I think there are way too many folks that probably just run through these topics like crazy, right? You can go online, you can find a lot of people talking about
Lots of different ways, like top 10 lists,
favorites of all time,
best.
music and all these kinds of things. That's cool. We can talk about all that stuff too. We're certainly well equipped. But I'd like to know what you guys want to talk about. We'll probably talk a little bit also about some of the kind of current RPGs and the things, the trends that we see from some of the classics that endear and have really, I think, shown into current RPGs.
And how history is affected, not just with video game RPGs, but Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop, role-playing games.
Yeah.
Because
if you're scared of such topics, you might want to leave now.
Well, but it's very related, right?
It is.
Because obviously, in many ways, when D&D was first developed in 1973, not to talk about that created a format that was kind of borrowed by the Western RPGs,
right.
Computer games at the time. Actually, I think the first game was D&D in like 1974. It did not take long for computer programmers to say, hey, I like this D&D game, let's put it on a computer.
I actually recently met someone who worked with a very prominent digital equipment provider from back in that era that used to work on mainframes for the government.
I guess that's all you had, really.
Absolutely.
There weren't really personal computers back then.
There were no personal computers. All there were mainframes. So when I started talking to him about some of the interests I had, he goes, "You're not going to believe this." Well, so he was like an intern as a teenager, and they would basically shut down all the operations at night. But, there were no networks, right? I mean, it was just shut everything down. Everyone literally locked the building and walked out. The first thing he decided he needed to do was get that thing playing Dungeons and Dragons, which he did repeatedly on government equipment for like the next 5 years with all of his friends. And if you talk to people that have any kind of position of prominence back then, I think you probably hear right about the same kind of stories. D&D really gives rise to what we know now as the RPG.
Yeah.
Right? So, you were telling me a story about it.
That was just kind of leading into the 80s, which is when, you had Ultima and Wizardry, which were the first big computer
You guys know
RPGs.
this? Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, I was about to say, if you don't, then you probably wouldn't be here.
Get out.
Yeah, get them.
We say big, but you're allowed to say.
Yeah.
But we say big, and they sold in the tens of thousands because, again, not a lot of people had personal computers back in the day, and they did all right.
The idea of an RPG, something like a console, would be laughable at best at that point.
Yeah, but if you talk about people playing RPGs in the 80s, which is when they really came to prominence, most people will mention either Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest. Especially in Japan, Dragon Quest is insane how many people go for that.
And what's interesting about this is that everything kind of becomes a straightforward Dungeons and Dragons at this point, right? So you have this kind of, and Dungeons and Dragons kind of takes a lot of lineage from the whole Tolkien kind of way of doing things as well.
So I was doing research for this movie, and now it's been a while, but this is how long ago. Gary Gygax has mentioned, or had mentioned multiple interviews, unfortunately he's dead now, Dave Arneson, that they mentioned that Tolkien mythology was definitely one of the things that was influential. A lot of pulp fiction from like the 30s, not Tarantino, but
Like cheesy pulp.
yeah, like
stuff.
Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. It's just like swords and sorcery.
Right, I wish I had the projector up. I could show the images from the first D&D books, like the
Oh yeah,
images
yeah.
and crap.
And
I
if you
mean,
look at the art, which is
totally
fantastic, by the way.
Yeah.
Going into that, yeah, it's interesting the different sources they drew from. And the thing is that they took that from. If you don't know the story of how D&D was developed, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but
Yeah, this is cool.
they were war gamers. If you ever played Warhammer 40K or something like that, basically it's for the uber geek. You got big tables with little terrain everywhere, and you have
Terrain and
armies moving
levels
around and
and strings
people
to
take
measure
out their-
distance. And
yeah,
It's
but
like Axis and Allies on steroids.
yeah, and they were
Yeah.
playing this up in Wisconsin, as you do.
Yep.
And
As they do when there's nothing else to do.
and they, yeah.
Drink and play war games.
This is true.
Uh,
But they decided, hey, this is fun. Wouldn't it be more interesting to tell the story of the people in these armies, like little groups of people who are like telling singular adventures, and so they got together and they made movies, and they released it eventually. Like I said, in '63, and then that influenced Ultima, Wizardry.
And what's the basis of D&D, right? You have basic character statistics, right, that measure certain kinds of capabilities.
Yeah, so, okay, let's talk a little bit about what makes up these classic, what defines an RPG versus a platform or something like that, especially in the classic sense.
Yes.
It's a little bit more muddled nowadays, but.
Very muddled nowadays. But this is not a modern RPG.
No,
so we'll talk about the classic.
that's tough. You got statistics, obviously.
Yeah.
Things like wisdom, charisma,
Strength.
You can call them different things, but yeah.
Yeah.
There's usually.
Armor class of some kind.
Yeah, and then statistics also respond to levels,
Right.
hit points, some sort of a magic or mana.
And then modifiers to equipment, things like that for basic statistics.
And so basically, it's if you play Super Mario Brothers, if you don't learn and get good at it, you're going to continually suck. The game doesn't change.
I can testify to this.
Yeah, if you
I
play,
am terrible.
If
at
you
Mario
play for
Brothers.
100 years, or 100 years, sure, I was gonna say 100 hours, but that works too. And you don't learn yourself how to, like, I can personally attest to this because one of the first video games I ever played was Super Mario Brothers in the arcade.
Before you had developed hand-eye coordination.
Yes. Yeah, it took me many quarters before I learned how to jump over the pit.
It was about $30 worth of quarters.
About
Yeah.
like 400. And then you get to the second pit. I think most everyone probably has played Super Mario Bros. So you can probably know this by heart. The second pit is larger. You can't just walk and jump over the pit. You got to learn. Hey, there's a run button, and then you jump. So you're learning progressively through the game. RPGs, the great thing about those, or I mean, depending on who you are.
Yeah.
The different thing about them is that you put time into it, you beat the monsters, and you're going to get better,
Right.
statistically.
Right.
You don't, there's not a lot of necessarily learning, that you have to do. It's not a hand-eye coordination kind of thing.
The concept of experience, right? I mean,
Yes.
XP and any myriad number of ways that people have come up to measure such things. You know, that whole concept is straight from Dungeons and Dragons as well, right? You have a basis of experience, and the thought is that as you toil and do stuff, although
That's a technical term.
and that stuff that you do changes dramatically through the course of classic RPGs, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But, you know, mostly that's just killing things, right? I mean, that's pretty much what Dungeons and Dragons is all about in the first edition. It's like, hey, we kill stuff, you know? It's like, okay, it's dead, you gain experience, and you gain levels. So the thought is that as you progress and the more time you put in, the better off you are, and the more fun you're going to have killing more stuff with your character. And there are limitations to that, right? I think, you know, Dungeons and Dragons creates a cool little universe within which people can kind of create their own stories. It's almost like it's not even like a choose your own adventure. It's more than like, it's more of like just write your own script to a movie and kind of act it out.
I think the first time, who in here has played Dungeons and Dragons or some variant thereof?
It's okay, you're among friends.
So the first time you play, it's kind of like you might be a little tentative. There's a lot of rules and very freeform, but then it kind of hits you like, wow, this is extraordinarily open world. I can do literally whatever I want. DM.
Are there girls there? I want to do them.
Yeah, I'm getting drunk.
I'm getting drunk. No, you're
Yes.
not. Roll the dice, see if you're getting drunk. I'm getting drunk.
By the way, as you can tell, we're kind of just going all out. So if you guys have questions at any point,
just
shoot it
interrupt
up.
us.
Yeah,
Just yell something at us. It's fine.
Anyway.
So, but that becomes limiting, right? So the limiting factor, I think, is that people want to tell some really engaging stories on their own, right? So you have this other kind of undercurrent within video gaming that video games don't have to just be Mario Brothers. They don't have to just be platformers. They don't have to just be asteroids. Or they don't have to just be, any of these classic Space Invaders, right?
Yeah, if you look at any other games of the time, I say Mario Bros. So that came out a few years after
Absolutely.
these RPGs first started. More contemporary are Pac-Man, like I said, Asteroid, Space Invaders, Galaxian. These were games that they're arcade games. They were meant to eat your quarters, and you had to get good at them, or you were going to just suck and lose a lot of money.
Meanwhile, back at the mainframe, all the people that were actually doing all this work on all these very high-tech computers, one of the other things they developed is the concept of the adventure game, and the text adventure game specifically. So how many of you have played Adventure, exclamation point? Adventure? Adventure!
Like on Atari.
No. Well, you can play it on Atari. It played on any number of myriad
There are a
systems
few
around
games
the world.
called Adventure.
You can play it for free right now online if you want to.
Yes.
It is the official little adventure version.
You're talking about the one made by Warren Robinette.
Yes,
Where
and,
you've got the pixel.
yes.
And that's your character, and he moves around.
Correct.
And he fights the duck dragons.
So there's this thought, yes. So there's this thought behind all of these things, that maybe we could tell some interesting stories through games at the same time. Then we throw in this RPG element to it, and I think that is what gives rise to what we all know and love as the classic RPG, or the golden age of RPGs, which is probably around the late 80s, early 90s into
Now.
Well, I mean, depending on where you want to make that era end.
Hold on, I'm not going to
Yeah.
close too much. You got your Western RPGs in here, and your
Totally.
Japanese RPGs.
Right.
They have different kind of golden ages.
I think that's true.
You started out, like you said before, you started out with your Ultimate Wizardry with multiple iterations in the early 80s, actually throughout the 80s, and some of the 90s.
Yep.
And meanwhile, over in Japan, you have a burgeoning video game industry going on. The video games started in North America.
Right.
I think we can all.
It's
okay.
We're not being racist. Like they literally started in North America.
But then you have companies like Namco develop things like Pac-Man, and of course Nintendo comes along with the Game & Watches, etc.
Right.
And Wizardry was especially popular. It's still to this day extraordinarily popular in Japan, and so that influenced Yuji Horii and a few other folks over there to create a dumbed down version of it for consoles, specifically the Famicom and the NES.
Yep.
And so they get to work, and in 1986 released Dragon Quest. And that's the first real.
How many of you played Dragon Quest?
Or Dragon Warrior.
Or Dragon Warrior,
That's
as
also
it's called.
So that was my first RPG, and it was released later in America.
My first RPG too, except I had no idea what the hell was going on. It was like, it's like the first time you jump in there and you start moving your character
It's
around.
fascinating.
What the
Did you
hell?
look at the Nintendo Power version?
No.
What?
No. Listen, I sat down at a friend's house who had Dragon Warrior, and I was like, oh, Dragon Warrior, that sounds badass. Reading for 10 minutes. And it's like, I don't know about all this. I was this geek. I also didn't have a Nintendo Power System.
Yes. Oh, well, we're getting a little ahead of myself, but anyway, Dragon Quest comes out, it's extraordinarily popular, and actually Yuji Horii has spoken to this before, as to, if you play any of the Dragon Quest games, maybe not so much 10, which just recently came out as an online RPG, but 1 through 9, you have decades of this game, slight changes. It's not like Final Fantasy where everything, like, they just start throwing.
That's a whole nother, we're going to talk about this.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We're going to treat, this is all built up to going to a place here, folks, trust me.
This?
What?
No.
Oh.
But no,
Go ahead.
all the Dragon Quest games are very, they don't mess with the formula very much. It's pretty basic. They add some interesting bits here and there. But and Yuji Horii, the developer of Dragon Quest, has spoken this before. He thinks it's a very Japanese sensibility. Again, not trying to be
Why try to
racist.
fix what's not
But
right?
it's a very regimented society where if you put in work, you will be rewarded.
Right.
You know, so again, that's what I was talking about before. If you're Mario, if you don't learn how to jump over that pit, you're gonna keep screwing yourself.
And almost to the point of statistical certitude.
Yes.
Right? So the other thing is, I think the Japanese culture is much more celebratory of those kinds of things, right? So they are interested in how I can game this
Yeah.
to be more successful, right?
Yeah.
So how can I progress my character to be the most successful at what I'm doing? That is, by and large at this point, an answer of statistics. There's not a whole lot of character attributes. You don't develop, well, I think I'd like to make my character more of a, sneaky type personality. It's like, okay, why would you say that? Anyway, but, you would max out the stats, right? You'd find a way to min-max and become better faster.
Yes.
And I think those are the two things that catch fire.
Those are also called munchies.
Right, much.
Yes.
Yes, not the card game.
No. But I think that's, for whatever reason, for most of the 20th century, classic RPGs were somewhat successful in America. But Nintendo in particular kept trying, pushing, sending out large players' guides and promotions to Nintendo Power. Here, take a free game, Dragon Warrior.
Nintendo staying on the sinking ship for probably a little too long.
Well, it's a Japanese company, so they're like, look, RPGs are super popular in Japan.
We gotta ram it down these people's throats.
Yeah, there's a lot more people in America. Why isn't it, if it's as popular as it is here, we're selling those games?
Yeah, it doesn't make
Ooh,
sense.
money, right? And it didn't work as well as they thought, obviously. And
For a long time.
For some reason, Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation is what cracked that code.
Right, and I have no idea why. We can
Because
talk about
that,
that. We'll talk about why Final Fantasy VII might have cracked the code, but Final Fantasy VII fundamentally changes everything there is to know about the video game industry, and I'm not, I think, overreaching to say that. It really shifts the balance of power in a lot of ways, and one of the reasons that all of us are here celebrating classic RPGs to a certain extent. So Golden Ages.
Yeah, and so that would start the golden age of Japanese RPGs, especially in Japan.
Yep.
Western RPGs on PCs mostly. Still didn't get hugely off the ground, kind of stagnated up until the late 90s, I would say.
So, and then, we have the kind of rise then in the, I would say mid-2000s of the Western RPG, which kind of...
I would say late 90s, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean,
Things
there's
like
some
Baldur's
seeds
Gate.
there. Yeah, but that's a PC kind of
Well, yeah.
niche product. But I mean, something like Skyrim or Elder Scrolls, which has always been around. Or Fallout. Fallout is and really any Bethesda series is probably a good example there. But because those guys are just freaking epic and crazy.
That was the Western Renaissance.
Yeah, it was the Western Renaissance. So you're right, the seeds were there. But I think, the explosion as to what kind of killed off a lot of the JRPG success in America, and really in the West in general, was the kind of emergence of the Western RPG.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
We're talking about golden age. I would say the golden age of the Japanese RPG
Yes.
was
That's coming young.
mid-80s, mid-80s to the end of the century.
Yes.
Because you had some amazing critical successes with the Final Fantasy was also influenced by Dragon Quest because Square looks and says, wow, they're very good at that, let's try that.
Yeah. There's a reason it's called Final Fantasy, because it was another Hail Mary. It was like a Hail Mary on top of a Hail Mary.
Actually, it's a false.
Oh, am I wrong on that?
Yeah.
Well, then correct me.
I can't remember the guy's name, crap. The guy who developed the game, he had been making some games for Square. I feel bad, I can't remember his name.
Well,
Something Japanese.
There's Japanese names.
But anyway, he was developing games for Square, and he wasn't having much fun, and he was actually going to go back to university to seek out. I think
So far, I'm good.
Going back for his music degree or something like that.
That's the story.
He's a young guy, and you have to realize we're mostly young folks in development. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to make one. I really want to make one last game. I want it to be something like Dragon Quest. I want it to be a fantasy game. It's my final game, and I'm gone. Develops it.
Yeah.
Square sells a crap load of content, and they say, hey, please stay and make more of this. And he says, okay, because I had fun with that. That's why.
So it was his Final
It
Fantasy.
was his. It wasn't Square. Square was doing pretty well at that time, actually.
Yeah.
But then,
Unlike now.
Yeah, I mean.
But we lament.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So you had Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. That was the 1-2 punch. You had other ones. You had.
Anybody in this room not played a Final Fantasy game? Never played a single one. Never played a single one. Okay, we got it. Cool.
But yeah, and actually Final Fantasy relatively was more popular over here in the 90s. Interestingly, I wonder why that is.
I don't know why that is, but there's a good argument to be made somewhere about what they were producing at that time and why that spoke so well to American audiences and why they, I think, failed to speak to Western audiences.
Netflix didn't release any of the Dragon Quest games on the Super Nintendo. Interestingly enough,
Yeah, it is weird.
they hammered out 1 through 4 on the NES, although 3 and 4 are relatively hard to find.
Because why make money?
Yeah, exactly. They kind of botched some things.
Yeah.
And then they just said Enix gave up. Enix gave up publishing for 5 or 6 years, I think. In the West, they said, look, we're losing too much money on things like this Nintendo. The Nintendo Power Promotion I've alluded to, if you don't know, in 1989, I think, Dragon Quest was coming out, I'm sorry, Dragon Warrior, they renamed it because there was some problem with the name in the West.
Whatever.
Something was already called that.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, so they released it, and if you had a subscription to Nintendo Power, they gave you a free game of Dragon Warrior. They would be like, let's go to the beach.
Why not?
Because we do things. I'm like, okay. Oh, the balls of light are an Aleph guard. I didn't find those.
That's terrible. Don't ever say that out loud again. Yeah.
Anyway.
So while at the beach.
Moving on to the Super Nintendo, that's where there's a little bit more acceptance of RPGs.
And this is incidentally, I think,
Phantasy
where
Star 2 on Genesis.
this is probably where we would call, I think you and I would both call,
This-
our golden age of the JRPG.
Yeah, this is, you had amazing games coming out this way, and some of our favorite games of all time. Final Fantasy 4, 2 over here, Final Fantasy 6, 3 over here. Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, I know you love.
Just love her. Such a great game.
Super Mario RPG,
Yeah.
which was Square and Nintendo playing nice for the last time before they gave them the big sayonara.
Yep, it's a big sayonara.
Why did that happen?
Why did that happen? It's really Nintendo. So it seems like when these companies get big, they get a little brash. So Nintendo was sticking with cartridges on the Nintendo 64, mostly because they wanted control, they wanted copyright or the copy protection.
Yes.
You know, at the time, there was not much copy protection on CD-based systems.
And Nintendo had already been burned once on this, right? So you gotta remember that Nintendo had created a disk system for the Famicom, right? And so the
Floppy
disk,
disks,
like a floppy disk system that attached, if you ever looked at the extension port underneath your NES, that's what it was designed for. It was designed to take a disk system and you plug into it. The issue is, they never released it in America, obviously. One of the reasons they never did that is because they got crushed in Japan with piracy. There was no copy protection whatsoever. You bought a game, you could copy it 100 times and use it in a disk system. And so, if any of you have ever wondered why Nintendo hates piracy so much, it stems back 25 years to this moment when they went, holy crap, we have to do everything we can to protect ourselves because this will end our company like that.
So then that's why the Nintendo 64, technically a much more powerful system than the PlayStation.
Yes.
And look at the 3D rendering models to Super Mario 64 versus, I don't know, anything on PlayStation. It's a much prettier system, but the size of the cartridges weren't enough, and Square was saying, they were getting to the point where, hey, we want huge games, we want cutscenes, we want this, that, and the other, and it was like, no, sorry, you're gonna have to do it all on a cartridge. And they said, hey, let's go with you. And the way, again, the Japanese, there's a lot of personal hurt feelings, honestly.
Yes, a lot of vendetta here.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the whole development of the CD was kind of a slap in the face with Nintendo already because I mean, they had been developing a solution with Sony for the SNES for a disc system, a CD-ROM based disc system that would augment the Super Nintendo, which would hopefully have some kind of copy protection. But at the very last minute, they told Sony to go fly tight and went with Philips. And Sony was so pissed off about that.
CDI came from.
that they actually decided to go with Ken Kutaragi machine, which was at the time in development, was the PlayStation.
Which is an interesting counter, or like, I guess, shadow of early on, Nintendo, looking in expanding their games in America, wanted to sell rights to things like Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers, etc., to Atari, so that they could put it on the 2600 and things like that.
Right.
And Atari said no.
Yeah,
Because we don't need you.
Yeah, they're crazy.
And so Nintendo's like, okay, fine, we'll make our own and we'll release it.
And so you have, I think you're seeing, right, there's a lot of kind of slaps that go back and forth here between these companies. You know, it's very personal, it's very executive driven.
It's very
like, how dare they embarrass me?
It's very public embarrassment, and that stays for a while. And when Nintendo and Square made up in 2002, 2003, the president of Square actually said, look, it was on me, I took it way too personally, I'm sorry for that,
Yep.
let's just make nice.
And they sort of did.
And please let us develop the Game Boy games.
Right.
So,
where people actually still play RPGs.
yes. So,
So
Super Nintendo was an RPG machine.
it was an RPG machine.
So what is your favorite? We might as well talk about our favorites from this.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say our answer is going to be the same. I mean, Final Fantasy VI is probably until I played Skyrim, was my favorite game of all time.
I'd still say that, yeah.
I absolutely adore that game, and I think that there are pieces of it that probably haven't aged all that well, or maybe I've aged beyond it a little bit. I haven't aged all that well, have I? Damn, now that you mention it. Feeling old these days, but I think there is I think most of that game really stands up very well, and I think if you tried, everyone has been screaming for so long for them to remake this game in ways similar to what they've done with a lot of the other favorites from this era, and they've done it over and over and over again.
It's interesting how Square keeps re-releasing and remaking games, and their two biggest games, Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, that fans are clamoring for,
They will not remake it. And I don't think that's a problem, right? So, I mean, Final Fantasy VI, how many people play it? Or 3 in America? Okay. So most of you. So, I'm not going to give anything away. Say, what's the believability factor of a general in the army, with this, sexy blonde, getting up on stage and singing full opera after a night of practice? Probably not great, right? So if you were to do that, I think inside the game space, inside the Super Nintendo, that works, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I think this is the golden age for me of RPGs is because it makes you connect the dots in your mind. So instead of them just kind of throwing everything at you and saying, here's the world, enjoy it or don't, it's kind of, here's half of the world. You're going to paint the rest in your head.
Fill the rest in your mind.
And I think that there's something really endearing about that. It makes you kind of connect more to those games. And I think it creates a better connection between the player and the characters.
Just a funny little note on that, because Final Fantasy VI is one of those games that has been completely and utterly looked over and just examined, because it's a lot of people's favorite game.
Yes, it is.
It's a masterpiece of music and storytelling and gameplay. But someone actually said, if you count out every single person in every single town in this game, the population of the world is like 400 people.
Yeah.
Right.
But my point is you can suspend disbelief in a Super Nintendo game, right? I mean, it's okay to do that kind of hokey stuff. It totally makes sense. You make that game for Xbox One or for PS4, right? And you have this kind of scene where you're controlling this opera singer on stage, and I just think there's something that's going to be dramatically lost there.
Yeah.
It's going to feel stupid, it's going to feel hokey, and it's going to feel fake, and I would much rather not remake it, to be honest.
I kind of want them to.
I mean, I kind of want
I'm kind of
I was falling over at the idea that you wanted it remade.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm not clamoring for a remake, but if they make one, I'd be like,
and how many of you played like remakes of Final Fantasy IV, for example?
yeah, well, that's the thing. Is
They're
that
very, very good.
And the Dragon Quest remakes, 4, 5, and 6 that they did for the DS, which is also an RPG machine, they are done extraordinarily well. So that's why I think they can do it like that.
What's number 2? What's your number 2 Super Nintendo?
I guess then.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts on them re-releasing or reposting 7 to Steam now?
No changes at all.
Like,
Zero.
Better than nothing. It's better. And it's actually a good way to cut. Well, I don't know. How much is a game actually going for nowadays on eBay? It's not a lot.
Well, the issue is it becomes prohibitive in some ways, right?
It's
I
an
mean,
accessibility thing, and then now you can get on.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a big driving factor, right? I mean, because I'm old, I think of Final Fantasy VII as being not that long ago, even though it was 1997.
But I'm looking around at some of the faces here, there's some young folks that weren't, either they weren't alive or they were.
Or why in the heck would they care about Final Fantasy VII?
At 8 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's a way for people nowadays to learn, and they hear, if you go on the internet and hear people talking about classic games like, oh man, Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy VI,
Yes.
whatever.
Of which there's
It's
a ton
like
of
one of the best things ever, and it can be hard for them to track down a PlayStation that works,
Right.
and a game, copy the blah blah blah. So
For me, it's more of an availability or archival thing.
I'm okay with that.
I love having those games be available to everyone. And to
I'm
cross
always
platforms.
okay with re-releases as it is. You know, the Chrono Trigger DS game was mostly unchanged. They added dungeon, but that was a big seller for them.
It's huge, and I think there's a good reason for that too. So go ahead. What's your number two?
Yeah, so this tells you how much I love my RPGs. I go these are all close, by the way, but my number one is Final Fantasy VI, my number two is Chrono Trigger.
I would say the same.
And my number three is Earthbound.
I would say number three is Final Fantasy IV.
Okay, well, there you go. Final Fantasy IV is in my top 10.
Yeah.
But yeah. And Super Nintendo is my favorite system of all time, so that shows you how much I love those three games.
Yep.
For
So-
very different reasons, but they're all RPGs, all Japanese RPGs.
Yes, and I mean, there's something to be said about the different styles that are in there too. Because
Yes.
those are three very different games that you mentioned.
It is, and Final Fantasy VI is well, they're all turn-based, but you know, you got your swords and sorcery, Evil Empire,
Kind of steampunk.
a little bit
Yeah, a little steampunk.
you know, starting to move into that and all that stuff. Chrono Trigger is a time-traveling epic. You go from 65 million BC to the future.
Right.
And you have, you know, your limited set cast of characters with a silent protagonist, whereas in Final Fantasy VI, I would even argue there was no main character.
Yeah.
But they all talk, it was all very fleshed out. You have a silent protagonist in Chrono Trigger, and you're, time travel. It's awesome.
Right.
And Earthbound.
And aliens.
Just that. No, but aliens are in Earthbound.
Aliens are in Earthbound, which is a great segue.
Which is a very quirky, you know, you have teenagers in modern day America.
Amen.
You know, and it goes off to other places.
Yeah.
And it's just quirky and funny and goofy, and the gameplay is slightly different, but it's still a turn-based RPG. But you know, certain things like rolling HP meters and things like that that are kind of unique. I'm sure other games have done them, but you don't see it very often.
And, you know, that being said, though, this is one of the there's similarities that run through all of this, right? And I think it is very much.
That makes them Japanese RPGs.
And not only that, but I think they're cohesive on the Super Nintendo. It's kind of the Super Nintendo experience, I think, is largely defined by these games, which is interesting. So then you have, I think, the explosion of 3D, which changes a lot. Right?
Yeah. So.
Because everyone wants to make you have the kind of essence of 2D gaming being the Super Nintendo, right? Almost the completionist form of 2D.
Throw that out. I'm sure
Absolutely. So Star Ocean people and folks like that, right? Okay, I've played Star Ocean.
Okay, so
entertaining. But
so meanwhile you have these games. These games are not so much Earthbound, but Chrono Trigger and the Final Fantasies did pretty well in North America. On the order of hundreds of thousands of copies at least. I don't think more than 1 million really. But, and in Japan, you know, they're just going nuts over all these games still.
Because that's what they do.
Well, yeah. We love games.
No.
And then the PlayStation hits and Final Fantasy VII comes.
Yep.
In '97.
Right.
And that, like I said, like I alluded to before, that opened the floodgates to.
Final Fantasy VII isn't like a shift of gears. It's like a completely different animal than Final Fantasy VI, right? I mean, between really a lot of the Final Fantasies that came out of the Super Nintendo, they're largely indistinguishable in terms of system, in terms of format. They just kind of changed the story.
That's when they started really shattering things a lot more.
Final Fantasy VII is such a dramatic and drastic change. But, I mean, if you were alive in the Western world and you had a television in 1997, you probably saw Final Fantasy VII commercials numerous times.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I had ever seen a commercial on television for an RPG.
And it was talked about on the playground. We were in high school.
Playground.
We had
On the playground. Where's that? Those are my days.
There was
Not that playground?
Yeah. So when we were in band class, we were nerds. Something that our friends would talk about.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Something we would talk about with a lot of friends were talking about Final Fantasy VII. Like, oh my God, I just got this game.
Yeah, I played
It's
this
amazing.
game.
So, and like I said, that opened floodgates, sold millions of copies in North America, also Japan, obviously.
And this is kind of the first
So,
real, I think, effects
Yeah.
of Nintendo's blunder with Square, to where PlayStation becomes at that point the de facto system to own.
oh yeah,
And
that was the first one that made it go.
there are a lot of great games for PlayStation, guys. I mean, that's a whole nother panel, right? So many great games for PS1, but Final Fantasy VII completely shifts the entire balance
There's
of
some
power.
great games for the Nintendo 64 as well, but they had that exodus of third parties.
Yes.
That was kind of led by Square, honestly. So what made Final Fantasy VII different? Why did that click in the Western mind as, oh, now I get it, RPGs are fun?
Yeah, I know. Oh, look at this. This is cool. You know, I think part of it is the kind of the shininess to it. I mean, if you play it now, it's kind of ugly.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
but it's like 3D.
kind of unplayable. You know?
3D. This was a time when everyone was like, oh, 2D gaming is dead, never coming back. 3D gaming is the future.
Yeah.
You know?
So, and I'll say this too, it's less driven by reading and more that you're actually kind of following a narrative with a camera, right? So you have this kind of, the escape from Midgar, right? I mean, this whole sequence that you're basically, I mean, you have limited interactions and kind of just, you know, I'm bringing the party around, and then, you know, battle, and then a cutscene. It just becomes this huge dramatic thing that I think appeals much more to contemporary gamers than if you did, you know, take a similar, the Escape from Narsh, the Caves of Narsh in Final Fantasy VI.
Right.
You juxtapose those things, they're not even close to the same. One is kind of like, you see these, like literally, there are these two sprites and they just go. Right? Like that is literally what happens.
Yeah.
In Final Fantasy VII, you actually see them like climbing a ladder. You get to the top of the ladder, and then you know, someone comes out and surprises.
You see the city. And,
You get to the edge, you hit a button, and he jumps. I mean, it's just like this is more of a I think of a kind of gripping.
Yeah, I enjoyed Final Fantasy VII. It's not my favorite, obviously, but I have to say I got goosebumps. You were with me. First time, because I didn't have PlayStation at the time, we borrowed it, and Final Fantasy VII from our friend who showed up about it.
If you don't,
I got later on PC,
Yes.
But, and yes, I have now a PlayStation 4.
I was really worried about that.
No, but when we were together and we were watching that opening cutscene where it starts with, you know, you got
The opening cinematic of Final
Eris,
Fantasy VII is just glorious.
and pulls up the music score of nobody who we haven't even touched on.
I know, who's
the music.
a huge part of the success.
Oh
of that.
god, he's
If you don't get goosebumps watching the opening cutscene of Final Fantasy VII, then
Especially back in the
RPGs
day.
are not for you, man. That is probably one of the best opening cinematics. Maybe not best opening sequences, but it was one of the
like
best.
not technically,
Correct.
but it's very.
The opening cinematic is just gorgeous.
I think that sold a lot of people right there.
Yeah, it's
So
yeah.
it's like, oh,
Put that
okay,
on as a demo.
that makes it
and
worth
wow.
reading through all this text, and you're right
Plus-
there in the action stage.
This is a point when the cinematic cutscene or the cinematic opening is not, by and large, widely accepted, right? I mean, that's not something that was really came into prominence until really at this moment. It's kind of contemporary to this game. So a lot of us were seeing something called a cutscene, and I don't mean a cutscene as in the action stop and they did a little exposition, but where there was actually a film that played, where you could literally put the controller down, sit back, and watch a movie about what was happening between now and
And then that's when you had like summons that lasted literally 1 or 2 minutes, and at the
one
time
of the
it was
biggest
like,
weaknesses of playing Final
cool,
Fantasy
look
VII.
at
Look at Leviathan, this is amazing.
He's just completely
And
right
then
the planet.
you cast it 5 times later, and you're like, get over it, man. I just do it. I just want to hit the damage button. Yeah, links around took freaking forever. But anyways.
So that opened up RPGs or Japanese RPGs to the West.
Right.
To me,
And then there was a deluge.
Yes, and that's what I was gonna say. To me, unfortunately, that it's like anytime there's a big popular thing that happens in any medium, you have copycats.
Double-edged sword.
Even
right?
from the same company.
Yeah.
So everyone thinks, oh, this is the key to selling in North America.
Right.
We need to have super overdramatic storylines that are incomprehensible.
Right.
We need to have
Spiky-haired, androgynous protagonists.
super long cutscenes.
Giant swords that make absolutely no sense for someone's relative strength.
Yeah.
Potentially guns.
Yeah, which is so it's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Gunblade.
Gun blades.
Gunblade.
I wish.
But yeah, this is the important
And
part.
super long casting sequences. Like people want to actually sit there and watch them. I don't know why they have that idea.
But yeah, so this is the thing that.
But other than that,
fine,
Lincoln, how was the play?
fine moderation. But when that's all you get for RPGs for at least 5 years, I would say. To me, the worst offender, like the maximum offender, and I do enjoy the game, but oh my god, it's incomprehensible. Is
Xenogears. And I know why people like Xenogears. I mean, I can see the allure there. I think a lot of people's favorite game of all is anybody's favorite game Xenogears? They're afraid to say that because now you say you hate it.
Okay, it's fine. No, because here's the thing. I was playing that in college, and I'm like trudging through. I'm like, okay, there's something with a god, and
it's a little abstract.
yeah, there's
a little abstract.
memories, and I don't even know. And so I put the game down, as you do sometimes, to actually work in college. And I get back to it 2 months later. I pick up the controller. I forgot the story.
I did the same thing with Chrono Cross, as a matter of fact.
Chrono Cross
is the same thing, yeah.
Chrono Trigger is a very nice, cohesive story. You got like what, 7 main characters.
Yeah.
You can follow everything.
Yeah.
Chrono Trigger. Chrono Cross, literally over 50 characters. It's so
Not cohesive,
overwrought
it's
under its own weight. And
Doesn't
falls
really-
apart. The best thing for us, the music.
The music is probably a cool harbinger of things to come there.
Who dares play Ni no Kuni for the PlayStation 3? Excellent.
Yeah,
I don't have a PlayStation 3, unfortunately, and I'm mad. This is the one game I want.
Yes.
A PlayStation 3 for.
Yeah, I know.
I got to play it. It's beautiful. Level 5. It's huge. But any fan of Japanese RPGs, classic Japanese RPGs, know Level 5. They are a Japanese developer. They have done Dark Cloud. Yeah, they've done the Dark Cloud games.
Dark Cloud was
I think Dark Cloud 1 was their first game, which was the only game worth the damn for the first year or so on PlayStation 2.
It was
And then Dark Cloud 2 is
a great game.
awesome.
Awesome.
They did development on Dragon Quest 8 and 9, which are excellent games. They've done the Professor Layton series, which is not really RPG, but
But it blurs the lines, right?
yeah,
I
they're
mean,
still great games.
Yeah.
And they did, Kuni, After the White Witch. Yeah. Which, again, if you're a fan of classic JRPGs, pick that up. That's amazing. And then, meanwhile, you have on the Wii, of all places, things like Xenoblade Chronicles and Last Story, which had to be begged to be released in North America. But they finally did.
And lots of sputtering starts too.
There's a third 3
What was the third one? I can't remember. It didn't get as good reviews, but yeah, it was the Operation Rainfall. It was like a big groundswell, and just recently, this is why I say Japanese or the classic Japanese RPG is not dead, because you have fans. Well, it's not dead in Japan, obviously.
Oh, definitely not Japan.
But you have fans in North America who are clamoring for these games. They want Ni no Kuni. They beg Operation Rainfall for these new RPGs. And Earthbound has been begged for on Virtual Console since Virtual Console came out. And then Nintendo finally says a few months ago,
we should totally do that.
You want
Yeah, we
Earthbound?
should. Oh, yeah, we should do that.
Why
That's
don't
a
you
good
tell
idea.
us?
Yeah, why don't you say so?
And
You
now
want
it's, last I checked, it's the second best-selling game on Virtual Console for the past month or so. Number 2 only to Donkey Kong, which is on sale for 30 cents.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, anytime there's a fire sale on Donkey Kong.
So yes.
So I think we just told basically the history of classic RPGs in 45 minutes.
Sweet.
And you all are still awake, so that's pretty amazing. Why don't we talk about what you guys want to talk about?
Yeah,
So
we got
what kind of questions about classic RPGs do you have, or thoughts do you like